Hi, I'm Dr. Gwen. I'm a clinical psychologist who's been empowering disabled individuals, their families, and their support systems for over 20 years. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel, where I curate tools, share mindsets, and promote habits to help the neurodiverse community thrive. Also, hit that notification bell so that you don't miss a thing. In this episode, I interview Dr. Dana Waters, professor at Antioch University, founder of the Awake Project, and downright rad activist for autistics everywhere. She helps us understand the gender differences between autistic men and women and how these differences have led to an under-identification of autistic women. Dana's passion, expertise, and lived experience weave their way through our conversation on cloaking, masking, the insanely effective strategy of externalizing executive functioning tasks, and why being a self-explorer has major payoffs. Anyone who spends any amount of time with Dana quickly gets her quick ability to make anyone feel seen, heard, and understood. In one word, she's epic. I hope you enjoy my interview with Dana as much as I loved spending time with her. Hi, Dana. Welcome to the program. How are you?
I'm great. I'm happy to be here.
Well, thanks for being here. Let's start with you introducing yourself and telling the audience who you are.
Okay. Sure. My name is Dr. Dana Waters. I'm a psychologist in Seattle. I have been here for 21 years now. I'm originally hail from Chicago. That's where I got my doctoral degree. I was born and raised in the Midwest, born and raised in Chicago. Got my degree, my PhD from the Adler School of Professional Psychology. And I sort of came into psychology with a little bit of a circuitous route. I had originally gone straight from high school to undergrad, thinking I was going to go the same direction my sister was, which was become a veterinarian. And I hit my first chemistry class, and that was the, that was the end of that. And I actually came home, regrouped a little bit, and then found out about a vet tech program that was not, it was in the same town my sister was going to school. It's a 2-year degree. So I vet teched for almost 5 years full time before I went back to school to get my undergrad in psychology and pursue my doctorate. I had certainly been interested in animals. I developed some pretty nasty allergies. So my doctor said, you should get out of this. And I also noticed that I was really enjoying interacting with the owners, and particularly in bereavement situations where we were having to put animals to sleep. And it's a weird thing to like, right? So in my own therapy, telling my therapist about it, she said, it's sort of like working in hospice, and you really are interested in trying to make it the best experience possible. I became interested in the psychology of what the clients were going through. And that's really what kind of opened the door for me in terms of understanding and wanting to pursue psychology. And I honestly didn't do great in primary or ed up to through high school. I did pretty good the last 2 years of high school. Prior to that, like C's and D's, which I like to sort of brag about now. I just think my brain wasn't working quite to that level, and I really wasn't interested. And once I got interested in psychology, it was fairly intuitive to me. Started getting straight A's. Kind of proudly say I kind of sailed through graduate school. And I really, it's not that I'm so smart. I just think it was so interesting to me that I just ate it up. Yeah. And I ended up in 2003, kind of on a lark, ending up doing a talk with newly graduating interns at the University of Washington and what to expect as a new psychologist. Someone else who was there kind of recruited me to work in a doctoral program there doing teaching. So I did a one adjunct class, really loved it. And I guess word got out, probably, I'm a Leo. So even though I'm massively introverted, when it comes to teaching, I kind of enjoy the performance aspect of it. So got good reviews, got recruited to work full-time. And I've been teaching full-time in a PhD program for since 2003, so about 18 years. I think I start my 19th year this fall. Interestingly, I teach statistics, which I didn't know well before I had to teach it. I learned a lot, and I actually love doing it now because I love making it really understandable. And I teach psychophysiology. The physiology I learned a ton about in working as a vet tech and vet education. So I love teaching both those classes now. And I tell the students it's good that I specialize in treating trauma, because all of them are most afraid of my classes in a psych program. Statistics and biology, they're all, and so I've been teaching for close to 20 years, working in some capacity as a therapist for almost 30. And I also have a very small private practice now, about 5 people a week in the office that you see me in now. I love working in a PsyD program, because one of the things they want you to do is to stay clinically working. So that it's part of my job requirement to continue to see clients. I actually got my initial training and interest in doing like body-based therapies, in using that idea of holism, and that's a Adler sort of construct. And then interestingly, probably about 2011-ish, I had a student of mine tell me that he was on the spectrum, right? And I was kind of blown away from it. I had all the stereotypes in my head of what that meant. He let me know about a couple of resources that were online, and I secretly took this thing called the Aspie Quiz, and I came out as very likely. And I was like, what does this mean? I kept it a secret, kept it totally to myself for about 6 years. And then I started to learn more about it, and ended up, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, self-diagnosing, which isn't just a psychologist thing. You can actually do that as an autistic person. And then I slowly came out, right, about that. I came out to my wife about it, and thought it would be a big deal. And she's kind of like, makes a lot of sense. And it's helped our relationship. And then I came out to work, which was really scary, right? So can a psychologist be autistic was a huge question for me. I was blessed enough to have a co-chair of that department and other faculty there that were very encouraging, saying, we know your work, we know you're great at what you do. And I just started an advocacy program that I was doing, and really probably would not have done that without the cheering I've gotten from that work. So it's been an interesting route getting here, but this has really become somewhat of my life's purpose is to impart knowledge about this and really help other people that would have never thought this was true for them find out that it might be true. And that's a lot of what I'm seeing as I'm talking to more people and putting more information out. So that's my working with complex trauma in my private practice. And then slowly eking, people have kind of found out that I have some expertise in autism. So I've been working with that with adults as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
so
that's awesome. I love that, your origin story, how you found your path. You and I were connected by a mutual colleague, and he said to me, you got to reach out to Dana, especially because she's got this real amazing perspective and expertise on not only autism, but specifically women who are autistic.
Right. Yeah. I love that, because I founded something called the Awake Project. It stands for the Autistic Women's Advocacy, Knowledge, and Empowerment Program. And then I've actually modified the advocacy part to also be activism, and I can talk about that a little bit later. And what I found was not only, there's been a lot written actually about how women get missed. Women look different. Women autistics look different than boys and men do. The tests that are traditionally used for all that, whether it's assessing children or adults, are all male normed. So girls or women might go in to get tested, and more often than not, they're being told they're not on the spectrum. And what it really is kind of trying to fit a round peg in a square hole. It's just the measuring isn't correct. And I knew enough about how psychometrics work to know that that was an issue. You really have to have the test norm to who you're trying to pick up on those tests. And then the other major thing I saw that was really missing, there's lots of online awesome women who are autistic themselves and who try to impart knowledge, but they're not mental health professionals necessarily. And then you have a lot of mental health professionals that are talking about this kind of thing, and they don't have the lived experience themselves. So what I was finding was there was a little bit of a chasm there between and some factioning, warring, honestly, going on between people that were identifying as autistic and really railing against the DSM and the medical community for its just pathologizing language and let alone missing women. So what I was able to do, and I've sort of always been able to do this, I know now it's probably part of being autistic, but I also used to chalk it up to my German, Austrian roots and Midwest roots, that we have something on our mind and we just say it straightforward. You know, I don't beat around the bush, I just say it as it is. And what my wife has told me and what other people have told me was you have a really good way of putting technical language that's in like peer-reviewed articles and those kinds of things. I hate using the word layman's language because I think it's a little bit demeaning, but non-psychologist language, being able to put it in terms that the everyday person can understand, and moreover, really translating it into a lived experience, right? Mm-hmm. So what has been described as repetitive behaviors or stimulating behaviors in like the DSM, and they sometimes look different in women. I can say, geez, you know, do you pick your cuticles? And have you done things that people don't see? Do you count? Do you do these various things? And being able to really translate that into more of a qualitative lived experience. And that, I think that's what's made the project take off to such a great degree. I launched it on Facebook, and as of a few days ago, I'm up to like almost 250,000 followers. It's 220,000 followers or something. And all over the world, men and women. And when I do get feedback, either people commenting on the post or they can message me directly, it's usually along those lines. Like, I've always thought that maybe this is true for me, but I didn't know. And you put it in words that I can understand. You validated my experience, and I tried to read Criteria or other books, and I didn't know what they were talking about, you know. So I think, having been a therapist for as many years as I have too, I'm really good at putting in language that people can understand. Mm-hmm. And that's really ended up being a great niche for me, and taking advantage of some strengths that I have too.
Yeah, so absolutely.
I can go on to talk a little bit about how women and girls are different. Now, I just posted some information this week, and there's the colleague you were talking about is in the midst of publishing a book on diagnosing folks that are about 50 plus, 55 plus in age. And the reason for that is when I went to school, there weren't IEPs. Autism certainly wasn't seen the way it is now. I mean, it was the stereotype, like Rain Man, you know, nonverbal, couldn't interact. And even if you had, I know now I probably had some reading issues growing up. You were put in a different level of reading that were sort of hidden in the different books you'd read, but all the kids knew, right? All the kids knew. The smart kids were reading from Kaleidoscope, and the dumb kids were reading Panorama, and I was one of the Panorama people, right? I know now that it's was a slow reader. I don't have binocular vision because of my eyes, so I oftentimes will skip lines. It just takes me a little bit longer. It's almost physically painful sometimes to read things, and the way things are organized has a lot to do with how people function. I'll get into executive functioning in a little bit here, but girls, in a nutshell, autistic girls tend to look more like neurotypical, and for the audience, neurotypical means not autistic. Autistic girls tend to look more like neurotypical boys than they have more in common with neurotypical boys than they have in common with autistic boys. And so girls tend to not, so I was the same way. I was friends with most of the boys and not a lot of friends with the girls. Part of it is kind of what the DSM talks about with social functioning, but it really is just, we don't like people beating around the bush. We don't like double talk. We don't like small talk. We don't like people not being direct and clear, like game playing, and boys tend to do that less. So we tend to gravitate more toward that. And girls tend to be able, the reason for us looking more like neurotypical boys is girls tend to sort of, read a ton about this, that we have more inherent social skills. Girls are geared more towards language-based behavior with each other, which boys are a little bit more action-oriented. There's been lots of research that shows that. So we can sort of cloak, to use a Harry Potterism, or a Star Trekism, get by and not look like we have any issues, right? So we can look socially normal somewhat, maybe not with other girls, but certainly get along with the boys. And girls tend to do what's called masking more than boys do. So boys, if you think about the sort of what you may have heard about how boys get diagnosed in school, assuming they haven't been diagnosed when they're much younger, they're acting out in class. They oftentimes are preceded with an ADD diagnosis because they're kind of squirrely in class, or they're doing these repetitive behaviors that are so classic about autism. And girls hide those as quickly as possible. They get a lot of feedback, right? Girls get more pressure to sit still. And my mom used to say to me, why are you always out playing baseball with the boys? Why don't you act more like a girl? I love that, right? I love doing that stuff. So girls really do get pressure to physically act a certain way, where boys get a little bit more leniency towards, at least in our culture. So we hide these things faster and better, right? To go underground. That doesn't mean we don't pay a price for that, but boys' behaviors are more obvious, right? Now, if you get into testing or trying to assess boys versus girls when they're younger, especially with kids, and you know this, the majority of assessments for little kids are questioning the parents. So then we're talking about observable behavior, right, by the teacher or the parents or a primary caregiver. If girls learn to mask and learn the scripts, social scripts early, people that are observing us aren't going to pick that up, right? So the assessments really have to be more about what's in our inner world. And that's what was crazy for me as an adult when I took my first Aspie quiz. Was I was like, have they been following me around? Is someone watching me and wrote these questions about me? How did they know I do that? So lots of stuff in my head, and that no one would ever see. And as a kid, I would never admit to anybody that I was doing, right? Almost OCD-like stuff, but it was all internal. Mm-hmm. So girls tend to get missed. Girls also tend to, I'm a bit of an exception, tend to, especially school is their special interest and they find a way to excel at that. More than boys, they tend to do really well in school oftentimes, right? Girls that don't are folks that are a little bit more profoundly affected, who are nonverbal, let's say, or have concurrent medical issues with that. If they're, for example, wheelchair, you have to use a wheelchair, or they can't feed themselves. Those are probably kids that aren't going to be in mainstream school, and they're more likely to be picked up as something else, let's say. So this masking thing really continues into adulthood, right? Mm-hmm. And if you can imagine an analogy for me, I was recently at a funeral, and it was in a very beautiful old Catholic cathedral, right? I'm not religious, but I was raised initially Catholic, so I kind of know if everybody stands up, you should stand up, and if you sit down. Every part of me wanted to just get up and move, after about an hour and a half. I'm like, if I was truly doing what I really wanted to do, I would have been like a little kid, who won't sit still in a situation like that. So we learn to kind of betray our bodies a little bit over time, and that you pay a huge price when you are not letting your inner self express what it needs to be doing outwardly, right? So it's usually energetically really draining. There may be an increase in stimming behavior later and that kind of thing. But if you're doing that for your whole life and no one ever knows you're doing it, then when you think you're autistic and you go to a psychologist for assessment, they look at you and they say, you're not autistic, right? So I really counsel girls and women to do as much research on themselves as they can and front load it and go to the assessor and say, this is what I do. I've even taken some of these online tests, and if I'm completely honest, this is what it looks like. And to really try as much as possible for them not to mask when they're getting assessed, so they can try to be assessed correctly. and go to someone who knows the differences in girls and women. Otherwise, they won't be rooting for it. They won't look for it, to look for those different ways of it expressing, right? So there's a huge, recently, I think they were saying about 1 in 60 people might be on the spectrum, and that boys outnumber girls 5 to 1. And the recent stuff that I'm reading, it's more like 2 to 1. If they're being, in terms of how many autistic boys there are for how many autistic girls, it's not as big of a disparity as we originally thought. And it really is about this compensating, learning to do it the way society wants us to do it. Doesn't come natural, right? Lots of studying about how people do things and things that you're supposed to say. And you can say, well, that's what everybody does, but we would sort of do that to the nth degree and would need to have these social scripts. And in a new environment where you don't know how to act, you don't have a script for, that's like the kiss of death, right? And it makes you so anxious. You're like, what am I supposed to be doing? So you can just default to being quiet, right?
Yeah.
I do think it's also why there's certainly extroverted autistics out there. You tend to see that more in men. My experience, and that this isn't numbers that I've seen in the study, is that women tend to be more introverted. Maybe it's because of that, sitting back and kind of seeing, what the situation is, and can certainly be extroverted in certain situations. Like when I teach, I would say I'm very extroverted, but I know like for the 2 or 3 hours after teaching a 3-hour class, I'm going to be exhausted, but in a good way. Yeah. So women really get missed. That's really the main reason why I started Awake, was to advocate for women and to raise that awareness more. Not just for people who think they might be on the spectrum themselves, but for the professionals like myself who don't know about this. I went through grad school. I was practicing for 20 years. I had no idea that women looked different until I really started reading about it and learning more about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And how important it is to understand gender difference. And
Exactly.
that those exist. I mean, they exist without having the diagnosis of autism, right? Like they exist.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
And maybe the other piece too, Dana, is this idea of introversion and like internalization. Like I keep it inward. And so I don't express. It's safer and it's a compensatory strategy almost for me to be quiet and observant and not kind of stick out at all. I kind of assimilate to my surroundings.
Yeah.
But that comes, and that comes at a cost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Being a woman, being an Asian woman, being a therapist. So you have like these layers that you can stack on top of that make you have that literal physical mannerism for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And two, going back to how children are raised, and I know, I mean, for you and I, we consider a lot of the biopsychosocial factors that really, really, influence how we appear and how we look, and when you said that, I was thinking about my own kind of immigration story of my family coming from Malaysia to Canada, and my parents very quickly saying, you're not speaking a different language. We're not speaking different language to you. We're speaking English. You may not, right? You're only going to speak English. We're going to speak to you in English, and we're going to forget.
Which is like a form of masking. Yeah, it's like a cultural form of masking. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Yep. And I look back and it's like, that's survival, that we want you to assimilate. We want you to be successful. We don't want you to stick out. We want, but that does come at a cost. And the thing that you said is this energetically draining. Right.
Yeah. I think that was probably the biggest aha insight for me, was reading about that. Mostly because I would, just like anybody else, we'd get invited to a party or something, and I would go. And part of me, as I aged, would look forward to those things, kind of dreading it. But it was more like, when can I get out of this, right? And I realized what it was so exhausting do that kind of socializing. And then the thing I haven't talked about yet are the sensory issues, right? So that is similar in boys and girls, and it can vary person to person. So going to a party, for example, where there's a lot of people, so your attention's getting pulled in different directions, and just literally the din of the noise and multiple conversations, and trying to figure out which one you should tune into. And also that impression management, like you talked about. Like if I was sitting at a party, I'd probably really want to just be sitting like this, like kids do now. I'd be on my phone, scrolling through TikTok. You're not supposed to do those things. So you engage like you're supposed to, and then you eat a bunch of foods that you're not used to, and you come home and it takes 3 days to recover. Right? For me, realizing what a energy drain that can be, to give myself permission to not do that as much, right? So I don't want to miss out on life, but I also realized I hate traveling. Every bit of traveling is a new place, different sounds, and different tastes. And if I can't sleep, after 2 days and my ears are ringing and it's horrible. And that relationally has to be worked out, right? It was great for me and my wife because she actually understood that then and said, oh, that's why it's so hard for you when we go back to Montana. And after a few days, you're kind of crabby and you haven't slept well and so on and so forth. To work those things out. I love the idea of VR helmets. That now they have these things where you can go like to Rome and take a tour. And I'm like, sweet, I want to do that. Do I actually want to go there? You probably have to anesthetize me and put me in a box and wake me up there, and I would still hate every minute of it because it's just It's too hard. Yeah, so it's a sense of that energy drain, and then also to compensate for that, you have to manage your energies. It took me a long time, even before my diagnosis, to figure out what I had to do when to make sure I had time to recharge, to do this other thing, right? And we've borrowed from the chronic pain world. A lot of people are familiar with this idea of how many spoons you have. So if you have a stack of 10 spoons and you've used up 8 of them, and you have something that's going to require 10 more, you're not going to get through it very well, or you're going to get through it and then you're going to take a week to recover instead of a few days. And then I think back to like what little kids are going through about that, who haven't figured that out yet, and who are still developmentally changing, and whose parents know that certain amount of routine is good for them. But then all of a sudden, why are they having a meltdown now? Because maybe they just ran out of spoons or something else is there. Little kids that can't really articulate the stuff as well, right? Yeah. Or as I can say now to my wife, and I love her so much for this, she'll check in and say, are you doing okay? I'm like, yeah, I think I'm going to leave. And she totally is fine with it now. Kind of gets that idea. So I work with people and tell them to navigate that with partners and family so they know that's what's really going on, right? Other people might have to wear earplugs in public. The gentleman that I mentioned earlier, who was one of my students, who's now a somewhat famous psychologist, his name is Dr. B. I don't know if you recognize that name. But he is really sensitive to light, exceptionally so. So he'll wear sunglasses even indoors to certain places, and a lot of hats that give him like that brim, so he can have the light not get him. And it's really learning what those cues are for you that will drive you nuts. And the thing that some of these are kind of universal, right? So clothing, like tags, right? If you can't, every bit of my clothing has the tag cut out because that scratching against the back of my neck will hijack my brain. I think back and that my mom used to do that too. So I think she might have been the one who's on the spectrum too. Clothing, things you're not used to, sort of physical constraining sorts of things can really have an impact. I have this white shirt that I wear a lot, and I have 7 of the same shirt. I have this sweater, 2 of each in about 5 different colors, so that it's predictable for me. I can wear it and have different colors so people don't think I'm wearing the same thing every day, but that literally my body feels the same. And that frees up energy for you to be able to do other things. And that's a lot of coping when you're first learning how to do this for autistics, especially adults who haven't been diagnosed before, and this is all new to them.
Yeah. I mean, what this conversation reminds me of is like economics 101, right? How our resources, how do we allocate resources?
Right.
And it goes back to this need to be very aware of who you are and how you work.
Yes. Yeah,
And
exactly.
sometimes I feel like that's where, psychologists can be helpful, in regards to, I find that for me, if I can provide a structure, I can ask the right questions, that can help my client develop their own self-knowledge.
Exactly.
Which then can move to how to cope with the world and to choose the demands that they place on themselves. And to weigh those things like, well, it's really important that I go to this family party because that's important to my family. But we've spoken and I'm only going to stay for half an hour, and at least
or make sure you have the whole next day off or something so you can recover.
So even knowing like your recovery time, how long it takes you, what's going to drain your health meter quickly,
exactly.
and fill it back up. These are good psychological concepts, but I think when you have a more vulnerable neurological system, it's so critical to know.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point too. So the DSM, and it's funny, I would meet people shortly after I graduated that were, the DSM is the most evil thing ever. And I, right out of grad school, I'm like, well, it's useful. I'm gravitating more towards it's evil side. It's got a necessary purpose in that it can describe certain things so we can get a frame on it, but to have it not be a one size fits all, but also the sense of that it's in the DSM, so it has this stigma. It seems like anything that's in the DSM, people have this idea that you ought to be able to gut through it, right? It's important to know that autism is a neurological condition, right? It has psychological implications, but it really is a neurological condition. In fact, the ICD classifies it as such. So you're right. So that sense of having kind of that hyper-aware neurology, at times, you can go to a phase of shutdown where you just are overwhelmed and then you almost can't feel anything. But it's different than trauma shutdown, like dissociation, because you're sort of hyper aware of what's going on around you, but it's like this bubbles around you that everything is kind of muted and it can't get in. It's almost like if you've ever stayed up more than 24 hours, like on a road trip or something, and everything almost seems surreal. It's kind of like that feeling when you're shut down. You're clearly there, which is very different than dissociation, which is really not fully there. And it's your body it's been overstimulated and it's shutting you down. It's kind of like when you get sick, where you fight off the cold, and then you finally relax and boom, it just takes you down for the count. So everybody has to learn their individual neurology, just like you said. There's a grieving process people go through where, especially if they're younger, I can't do this, and this anymore, or I can't do it as often as I'd like to. And really learning what their energy bucket is. And then I always use the analogy of a bucket full of water, and everyday stressors add some water. Okay, so getting up in the morning, dressing yourself and going to work, that's a certain amount of water. You had something you're not used to eating last night, and that's another thing of water. For women, you're having that time of month, which is maybe 3 pails of water if it really affects you. And then something that you normally can handle no problem, you see a commercial about a puppy in peril and you lose it, right? Where normally you might be able to handle that, and now your bucket's already full. And so it sort of is like that spoon analogy, but I try to do everything I can to keep my bucket as low as possible, especially if I know I'm going to go into something stressful, right? Hence I had eye surgery recently, and I really tried to not plan anything around that month or so of recovery, because I knew my bucket was going to be sensorily right at the top, and it was. So it's good that I did that. But 8 or 9 years ago, I wouldn't have known to do that, and I would have just had a really hard time and would have paid the price for that, for sure.
Yeah. Dana, if people are listening to this and they're like, that's a skill that I'd like to add, right? What would you say are some helpful suggestions to understand, that bucket? It's so funny you use the bucket analogy. I use the bucket analogy as well, where I'm like, it's right at the top, and whether you got given a purple pencil or a pink pencil, It seems very small, but that was the drop that led to the overflow,
exactly.
Then you're blamed because your reaction is disproportionate from this, when it really was a cumulative, kind of effect.
Yeah. Exactly.
But any suggestions, for people who are like, gosh, this really speaks to me, and like maybe even sharing how you developed your own awareness of yourself?
Sure. It brings up another thought I had, and that was the DSM sort of has these major areas written down for autistics. And one is like, we don't socialize well, which is overly reductionistic. It doesn't mention the sensory thing in just the categories, which is a huge thing. The third one really that we talk about and is only kind of peripherally talked about is the cognitive issues, and specifically executive functioning. So executive functioning is your brain's ability to organize, your brain's ability to prioritize, your brain's ability to say, I'm going to do A first, B second, C third, and so on. It's sort of an ordered kind of thing. It also is responsible for gauging like those energies. Like, do I know if I do this last thing, am I going to go over? So executive functioning might look different from person to person. If you know how to look for it as a therapist or a self-explorer, you could say, oh yeah, that's executive functioning. I used to think I was I'm uber organized. My students talk about this all the time. We love you, you're so organized. And I think, was I like this when I was a kid? No, like I said, I did terrible in school. My room was a disaster. It was a mess. And I really credit my first getting organized with my vet tech degree. Medicine is so much about protocols. It's so much about do this thing this exact way. And we would get tested on that, right? Bandage this dog's paw with how we showed you to do this. And you always have to do it you literally have to do the wrap a certain way. You have to start from the bottom and go up and then back. And I really think that helped me. And working in that profession for as long as I did, the day was predictable. You did certain things in certain orders, and you got to repeat that until it got to be sort of a routine, right? Which autistics really thrive on routine. If you don't have that inherently, I really do think I picked up those skills from that time in my life, because I was able to transfer them then to undergrad and then to my doctoral program. What mostly helps folks who don't have good executive functioning is to externalize it. So lists are great. And every time I say lists to my clients, I can see them bristle like, oh, she's gonna make me do lists, no. And I say, okay, bullet points, or what I love to do when I make myself a list, I always draw a little box, right? And then I write the thing, because I want to be able to check it off. I love and in terms of executive function, it isn't even just the fun part about being able to check it out. It's that helps you track what you did and what you don't have to do anymore, right? So whether it's I've had clients use a whiteboard, Post-it notes when those came along, those are great because you can order those in different order. So if your brain doesn't do this naturally and you're wondering about gauging your energy, write out the things that you need to get done and physically look at those things. Do you need to take some things out? Do you need to move them? Do you need to, what's really common for me, and I hear a lot with autistics, is this thing I want to get done is gnawing at me and it's making me anxious. Mm-hmm. Like setting up for today, I knew I had to set up the office and get my light ring so the light was right. And I had another thing, I have monthly billing to do too. And I was like, all right, this is ridiculous. Monthly billing, getting ready for the interview with Gwen. How much time does the monthly billing take? 45 minutes at the most, knock on wood if it's going well. I have 3 hours. I'm going to get that done first, check it off, and then I can be fully present for this and not be worried about that. Mm-hmm. That has been probably single-handedly the most important thing that I've taught other people, and the most important thing for me in tracking how full your bucket is. Now, you can also, let's say you have those things you want to get done and you can order them physically where you can see them. You can also then add into there, what are the things that are currently high demand right now? So you can even have another row for it, however you decide to do that. So whether that's I'm having eye surgeries, or I'm prepping for a new class I've never taught before, or I am having to do some socializing because I have to go to this funeral, right? How do you then, if you have a limited capacity, how do you move those things around? So I might then be able to, okay, this woodworking project I'm working on, it doesn't have to be stained today. It could be stained another day. But if you literally are not seeing that in front of you, it might gnaw at you. And then what does happen is people just get overwhelmed and they can't do anything then, and they get paralyzed. So if you're able to take that thing in our brain that we don't do exceptionally well and externalize it somehow, and I really do like to have people we'll co-create what works for them. Some people want a little book with them at all times. I've seen people, younger folks, do it on their cell phone. I'm more analog, like my calendar is still on paper. It's the one thing that's still analog. I've had, like I said, I have people do Post-it notes. It really has to be something that works for that person, right, that they like to do. I had a person do a really elaborate wall hanging that had all these little pockets, different categories, and then these little cards that she could slip in and out of it. And every night, she got in the habit, every night before she went to bed, figuring out which ones were for that day, because she had a whole month's worth. And she could move them around. I never saw it in person, but I saw pictures of it. It was spectacular. But working with people to get them to understand that idea and come up with something to externalize their executive functioning, because it's not something we do greatly, right? And the starting point becomes the most important part. So getting started, taking a first step, getting something down. I'll get a task to do at work, especially if it's something that I haven't done before. And I'll be sitting there in my mind, I'm going, oh my God, I don't think I can do this. I have no idea what I'm doing. And now I know to say, can you tell me what the starting point is? Can you tell me what the major points of organizing this are? And then if I have some sort of frame, which is really what executive functioning is, I'm a workhorse, man. I can do a deep dive and really get into it, but the frame isn't always there for me. You sometimes have to ask for help to get the frame. So executive functioning is the biggest thing that if I had a magic wand, I would ting people with to have that for sure.
Yeah. And I think one of the most complicated things about executive functioning is it's not just one skill, right?
That's right.
A suite of skills. I really appreciate this idea of like the most important part is the starting point, because task initiation or getting something started really is tough. I mean, I know for my clients, we can come up with plans and we can come up with lots of ideas. They'll tell you exactly what they need to do, but actually doing the first step is so hard. And I know that if they can do the first step, we'll have enough momentum to go to the others. But it's always that first step. So it's finding sometimes the little tricks to kind of
so I'll even say, okay, if the first step you can't get done, we need to break that down into steps. So I love a term that a mentor of mine used once when I was doing movement therapy. She called it an almost nothing movement, right? So that it's like something that you do that the other person can't even see, but you can feel it. So like if I'm working on a woodworking project, and I don't know where to start. So I know now just to at least draw it out. And I'm such a perfectionist. I'm like, I've got to get my graph paper and it has to be perfect. I have to then break that into smaller pieces and say, no, a rough draft is fine. Or if I'm thinking I've got to get this wood and get it home and put it together into this thing and cut it. And, I have to move my car out of the driveway to get the saws out, blah, blah, blah. I can literally give myself permission to just go buy the wood. So I go there, and sometimes I've even had to say, I'm not even going to buy it. I'm just going to go to the wood store and look.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Or think about it. So then my wife has been so great in helping me break some of this stuff down sometimes. She'll say, okay, so go buy the wood, just put it in the garage. You don't have to touch it for a month if you don't want to. It sort of gives permission to not get overwhelmed by the first step. So whenever I get stuck, other people get stuck on that first step, we need to make that into multiple steps as well. And you're right. Once you start one, you tend to, now the hard part of getting it in my car and getting it home. And, I have these Tyrannosaurus arm, they're not real strong. We call them my Tyrannosaurus arm. It's physically hard for me to get home big pieces of wood. So once I do that, I usually do wait a week or two, let the bucket refill or let the bucket decrease and then start from there. But you're right. The starting point can really be a bugger. Really hard.
I love this concept too of having frames and this co-creation. You know, people have to do what speaks to them. We need to meet people where they are. I love, you know, the woman that you were talking about with the pockets. You know, when I approached my dissertation, I was so overwhelmed by the process because it's a big project, right? And
it sure is,
writing is hard for me. You know, my first action step for writing is open Microsoft Word. like that's always my first step, you know, like if I can do that and then I can, you know, and I can start with like, just even if, you know, I'm a report writing, I'll pick something that's kind of mindless for me to do. And that always gets me started.
Exactly.
But I wrote every quote and piece of data on its own note card. And then I had in my living room was like this work board. And I basically ordered how I
did the exact same thing. Index cards. I did the same exact thing. I learned that system from an undergrad teacher. And be careful if you have cats, because they'll come in and you have them all in order and they'll run into the room and slide his cards.
I had a dog and he did find a lot of sleeping, and was like, oh no, my God. I had to like number and pencil eventually and then array, you know, and anyway, but it's
and that's a great example of externalizing it. You're organizing it. And I have a good friend of mine who's an accomplished author, Laura Brown, who can create a book in her head and go away for a long weekend and just spit it out. So clearly her executive functioning is not a problem, right? I would never be able to do that. I'm more like you, where I have to put the pieces and move them around. And even then when you write it, you kind of write it like, I hate this. And then you go back and fine tune it.
Totally. Exactly. Just kind of accepting that the first draft is the first draft, and you just need to get it on the paper so that you can actually see it and then do something with it, right? And how that is. It's so funny. It warmed my heart when you were like, I got to write the boxes. I got to draw the boxes because same with me. I like to see it. I like to check it off, but then I like to see what I've done. Like, it's really helpful. Our brain's not meant to keep all of these little details inside, you know, and the other thing I've experienced is so many of my clients want the loops to be closed. They don't like open loops. So
checking the box lets you close one of those.
Close the loop, you know, move on. And then you're not it's kind of like, you know, the internet, where there's things that might be taking up bandwidth that aren't necessarily a program that you're seeing front and center, but bandwidth is getting taken up, you know, behind the scenes. So
I'll even do sometimes, like I'll do a check mark, which means I've sort of grabbed something and I've gotten it, but then I have to do another X through the check mark that says it's really done. So there's even ways to sort of give yourself credit for the fact that you did part of it, but it's not perfectly done, just like you're talking about. So it becomes a placeholder for not having the circle closed. Because not having that circle closed, we are excellent at perseverating and obsessing, having what we call ruminating thoughts. And so externalizing those and writing those down even non-autistics for me as a therapist has been the single biggest way to get people to stop obsessing. It's on paper, you've written it down, it'll be there tomorrow. Now you can let your brain go and go to sleep. And if they don't write it down, they'll just have that brain going and they won't be able to sleep at all. And then that reinforcement, like you said, you want to see things that you've accomplished and get them done. I think that's why, as a psychologist and a teacher, I've gravitated toward things like woodworking, because it's a physical thing that I can see that I've finished and done. It's there to look at, you know? And that's really important for us as humans, to be able to see what we've generated and what we've done. It's too easy to forget about them, like you said.
I'm so glad that you brought us back to executive functioning, because it's such a big part of living an adult life, or a life with independence and autonomy. I mean,
exactly.
so I'm so glad that you brought that up. Hey, Dana, you know, when we're talking about knowing yourself and being able to build coping mechanisms and strategies, the word that comes to mind is advocating. And you and I have spoken about like the difference between advocacy and activism.
Yeah. Advocacy for me might be advocating for myself at the doctor's office, right? So like I hurt my knee, I went to a doctor who diagnosed it. We scheduled the surgery. I had some follow-up questions. I wasn't getting any response. And I'm at the point in my life where I'm like, this is not going to work for me. So I started advocating. I started just emailing them and calling them, and they weren't responding. So I switched doctors. I sort of advocated for myself and wouldn't put up with that. I can teach my clients, I work a lot with chronic pain folks as well, teaching them to advocate for themselves. Activism is really more about promoting social change. So I really do see like the Awake Project being a little bit of advocacy, but advocacy can be done by people that aren't having that lived experience as well. And certainly activism can be done by people that aren't having a lived experience, but it tends to be done by people that are the most affected. I mean, think about the Black Lives Matter movement last summer, where it really got big enough that everybody becomes aware of it. People that were physically marching out on the streets and were here meeting with the Seattle mayor to change policy, that's really activism, right? So that's not just having it, raising awareness and it being out there, but actually trying to change what's happening is more of activism. And really the word active kind of gives it away, right? Someone I work with was integral in helping write the amicus brief for APA to give to Congress to advocate and perform advocacy for the kids that were being separated from their parents at the southern border a couple of years ago. And so even though he wasn't standing by these people, you know, saying, you have to do this, it was a policy change, right? To really work for an amicus brief to change policy. And that's about, to me, is about as activist as it can get, right? Other examples that people might be more familiar with is like, you know, animal rights activists chaining themselves to something so you know, a whale can't get killed or something along those lines. Those are action oriented, and you can think of that as activism, right? I'm just starting now, I think, to really understand the difference between the two. And activism, I think, is a skill to pick up, right? Because it's hard to do alone. You probably want other people to do it with you. You have to raise your voice, and you have to raise your voice to people that you know are listening, so that you can promote that change, right? And the target of activism, I think, is people always think, oh, it has to be like to change a law or something like that. That's true, but I think it can also be to just like what I do at the Awake Project, where if I am putting something out there and it really changes someone else's worldview about a family member or themselves, to me, that's a form of activism. It might not be direct, but it's out there and it's promoting that, right? Changing minds, normalizing this somewhat. My coming out as autistic as a psychologist was probably more of an activist move than it was advocacy. And this other colleague of yours that you were talking about, I connected with him initially when I promoted a Awake Project on APA's Division 33 site, thinking, oh my God, these people are going to find me, they're going to take away my license, you know, all the silly fantasies you have. And he reached out right away and said, yeah, there's a few of us. And we do kind of keep it kind of quiet. We don't really, and I was like, well, that isn't okay. We have to start speaking up, you know, because how are we going to change how psychologists think about autistic people if we don't speak up? And that's more about activism, I think, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so important to, because we talk a lot about advocacy, you know, and in my work, a lot of even, the other professionals that I interview, we talk a lot about advocacy, right? And it's kind of going back to when you were talking about the little ones still developing. In my mind, I was like, yeah, and they have no language or lexicon in which
they need an advocate. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They need an advocate then. They need a partner to help them communicate and advocate for themselves.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which we want them to have. Obviously, we want everyone to be an active agent in their own life, to drive their own life, and how important that is. And so the ability to advocate for yourself, is important. But this idea of activism is changing so that others may also benefit.
Right.
And yeah.
I wonder, as you're saying that, I'm wondering too if it has something to do with a nomenclature difference. So typically, and this is not 100%, but typically when a child has autism, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, usually the parent speaking for them, and they'll say they have autism. It's what we call person first language. Joey has autism. And almost universally, when you're talking to adults who it's them, the one that has it, we call it identity. And I say I'm autistic. To me, to say I have autism, I don't have a disease that needs to be cured. I do have now known genes that lead into this. It's just as much a part of me as the color of my eyes and, everything else. But I understand why that mindset occurs for parents. I'm not a human parent. I've had animals, but I don't propose to sit in their feet and judge them and tell them you shouldn't do this. But I think that's where some of the knife edge is of even those two words, the difference between advocacy, where it's more about getting things for your child that they can't get for themselves or speak for themselves, and activism, where you're a fully formed adult and you're talking about this. And it is more of like, hey, see me, I'm a representative of this thing, and using different language for that. And it's the first time I've thought about those two being related. I wonder if there's something there. Yeah.
Well, I think also, Dana, like if we think about even psychology, the history of psychology, I think back to some of my early training and how I was always encouraged to use person first language.
Right.
And then I started working like really solely with teens and adults. And it became really clear to me as we were talking about preferences and the way they wanted to identify. So to which I started to change my language to more identity first language, which is really why this channel is Disabled and Empowered. It's identity.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes,
And because it's not something that you have, autism or ADHD, whatever, isn't something you have and you should be ashamed of, and it's some sort of disease that you need to contend with, right?
Right.
It's the same as me being an Asian woman.
Yeah.
Whatever, right? It's the same thing. And it's so interesting. I love that you bring this up because I'm more, now that I'm not working with younger children as much, because I'm only working with individuals who are 16, 17 and over.
Okay.
My own professional language has moved to identity first language.
Interesting. Okay.
Versus person-centered language. And we just are unabashed, like we go for it and we're like, there's nothing wrong. Let's just solve this problem. Whatever is happening for you that's causing some suffering, let's problem solve that. Let's co-create, as you said, let's co-create the solution for that. Let me help you be a co-creator in that solution. The other word that you use that I love is a self-explorer.
Yeah. I wonder too, dovetailing on what we've just talking about around self-exploration, is developmental issues. So little kids are still going through these developmental changes. Their identity shifts. It is usually around, late adolescence that we think of more awareness of self, right? So that may be why there's a natural progression to identity first as well, like who am I? And the sense of self-exploration, I personally think it's lifelong to begin with. As finally, when I was in graduate school, I tended to be younger than, I had some younger clients. I had some clients around the same age, but I was never older than anybody. And, at one point, and I get to the point where I'm doing my billing and I'm looking at birthdays and I'm like, I'm older than all my clients now. So, right. Part of it is that you had enough time with those things and they really are identity based. They're no longer these things that are external to you. They're identity based, right? I still tend to see disease sorts of things. Like I have an adrenal gland issue. I have a cyst on my part of my brain. It's a disease-based thing. So I don't say I am adrenal insufficiency. I say I have it, right? Now I do say I'm disabled, and that's one of the main things that contributes to that for me, right? Because it's not something that's going away. It's something that I do feel like it's an identity-based thing because it spans every part of my life, right? Not just like one area. And for everybody to explore and figure out who they are and to learn who they are. And I first learned this by doing what we call parts work. So it doesn't mean you're a multiple personality, like what I first talked to clients about this. It's not that you have separate personalities, it's that you have aspects of yourself that are different. We all have this. So my demeanor when I'm teaching might be different than my demeanor when I'm with my family, or might be different than my demeanor when I'm building something. There's these, and most people can relate to that. So we all have aspects of ourselves that serve us well in different situations. Maybe very far apart, maybe very different than each other. So when I was first learning about that, that's a great way to explore parts of yourself. So like my really young self, still there in some ways, my adolescent self, my angry self, my anxious self, and so on. And then that learning actually culminated in what we call the parts party, where you had other people play your parts. Right? You get little index cards writing out what that part does, and then you watch them interrelate with each other. And it was so important learning for me because it made me not black and white. It made me know that I'm continually finding parts of myself, maybe new parts that I integrated the old ones, and it tends to take some of the shame out, right? So I could say, geez, I was really tired and exhausted and crabby and I hadn't anything to eat. Of course, my anger part came out. But if I'm just saying to myself, oh my God, I was so stupid that I got mad at that person, right? There isn't a depth of knowing there. So when you explore self and get to know these aspects of yourself, there's more self-understanding too. And that was the big thing for me when I finally realized I probably was autistic, was just reading everything I get my hands on. What I would do is underline and mark the pages that I related to. And it was really a way of getting to know myself in this particular realm, these parts to me that I hadn't labeled yet as my autistic self parts, right? And I, as a therapist, of course, that's what we want people to be doing all the time. And lots of people that come to see us haven't done much of that. And it really helps to be able to do that. So yeah, self-exploring. I have a lot of clients that do cosplay and video game play, and even I think they call them furries play. And these are, and they won't tell anybody else about them, and they'll sort of sheepishly tell me, and I'm like, I think that's awesome. This is a part of you, and we'll fully explore that. And our culture has really gotten away from that. Other cultures really do that more. There's more costuming and permission and times to be other aspects of yourself. And the one that's mostly missing for us as adults is play. Oh my God. I still get the craziest looks when I'm being silly and goofy, and I'm just unapologetic about it now. I've learned to be like, you know what, this part of me is too awesome. I'm not suppressing her. Yeah. I really have to have that aspect of self and constantly learning, and getting to know you, to use the King and I ism, that song, Getting to Know You. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. And to be able to hold multiple parts of yourself at the same time, right? Mm-hmm. That one is not just because, and I think emotionally, the thing that has been so freeing for many of my clients, even for myself, is the idea of, wow, I can love you and be angry with you at the same time.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
isn't
just
that a revelation, right? Yeah.
it's so freeing to understand that. And it's
Mhm.
kind of like any good, comic book character. They're
Mhm.
always good when it's not just good versus evil, right? It's like,
Right,
it's
right.
when your villain has some good aspects and qualities that you find yourself rooting for them and then questioning yourself. It's like,
Yeah,
whoa, but there's a
exactly. Yes.
complexity to that
Yeah.
character.
Yeah.
That's really,
Yeah. Movie makers have known that for a long time. I mean, I'm going to age myself a little bit here, but like, Godzilla versus King Kong, you always
yep.
felt sorry for them. Somehow you got you were given an appeal to them, right? But I love what you said about the same time, because if I had to have sort of the top 5 things that therapists impart to clients that are the most groundbreaking, having more than one thing operating at the same time is one of those, right?
Yeah.
You can be mad at this person and sad at the same time, and they'll look at you and they'll go, "What? I can?" And yeah, I think that that's some of what I meant by the black and white too. We're a pretty black and white culture. We learn that when one thing's operating, the other ones can't, and it's just not the way it really is. There's all kinds of things going on at one time.
Yeah.
And it's naming them that becomes really difficult for a lot of people, and that's sort of a thing for autistics as well. In real time, verbalizing. It's why the DSM says we don't verbalize well. It's that we don't have that executive functioning in real time to order things necessarily. And if it's something new to us, we'll just be like, danger, Will Robinson, I don't know what to say. So I'll tell people, take your time, write it down, get it in order, tell the person, I need to do this because of who I am, and then send it to them or go over it with them. And it's not that you're wrong or bad or whatever. It's just that you need to externalize that executive function to get your thoughts in order, right?
Yeah.
To be articulate. I can be really articulate in things that I know about, but if it's new to me, I can't talk and if you get anxious on top of it, it's not going to go well. So yeah, being able to voice who you are to other people, to be able to put narratives to it and words. It's one of the things I do as a therapist. I'll throw words out there and say, let me know if any of these stick, and feel free to tell me if the 20th word I give you still isn't the right word. I'll keep going until you get the right word. And so you have a way to describe that part of you.
Yeah, that's awesome. We, a lot of times my clients and I will Mad Lib it. I don't know if you like Mad Libs. So I'll be like, okay, here's this script. Let's fill in the blanks of what makes sense. And then we'll just like drop down cycle words, it's like, and then it's like, when it resonates with you, that's the right word.
You'll know when it resonates, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's just, the ability to, because I love that, like externalize it, right? If someone knew how to do it, they would. I mean, I think.
Of course, if you think about little kids, developmentally, when you ask them questions and they give you one-word answers, and then adults sometimes get frustrated. It's like, they're 5. But they go on and on about stuff at other times. I'm like, well, it's usually something they really like, right? And they know a lot about, and the person they're comfortable with. So it really is sort of like, if you just think about your mind back then, how it used to be, and give yourself a little bit of a break. But, society doesn't like that, right? It doesn't like people meandering around to the point when they're saying nothing, and they seem to be kind of just wasting time. And if we can't change that about you, the getting to know you part of you then is to say, you need this external frame, and you make it known to the other people that you need this. And I've done that a lot at work. I'll say, I know I don't always speak up about something right away. If I come back in another meeting the next week about it, I don't want you to think that I wasn't paying attention. It's just taken me that long to get my thoughts together. And they all know me well enough now that they can say, oh yeah, okay, it's just as valid a week later, and we want to talk about that. So it's getting to know you, but it's also educating people in your life about how you do yourself, how you move is so important. And maybe even more important, right? Because if you are surrounded by a bunch of people that don't understand you and don't love you and work to move around the way you move, it's horrible. And nothing is more validating for an autistic person than explaining to a family member, this is how I do it, and the family member going, reflecting it back sometime. For me, it was my wife saying, you don't have to go, but if you want to, here's this thing. And I would say, always ask me. I don't want you to stop asking me, but I'm almost always going to say no, but keep asking me, right? And so letting them know about that kind of thing, because you never know if one day, I do want to do that, and I'll go with you, right?
Yeah.
It's almost as important to educate the family and work and friends and people that you relate with. And the ones that love you will take the time to do it because you're important to them. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Being able to surround yourself by people who can see you is so important. So Dana, you've kind of hit upon this, but I love ending with this, which is, if you could only choose one skill to empower someone with, what would it be and why?
I have to go back to that executive functioning. If we're talking about folks, autistic folks, it would definitely be that. I think that's the thing that causes the most suffering, is difficulties with that. And having not been given a frame or some sort of system to compensate for that. So that, that would certainly be that. If we're just talking about no holds barred, not having to do with autism, I think it'd be great if people could fly, because, it'd be cool. People could fly.
Well, yeah. or teleport. I mean, I don't know.
Or teleport. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, you might have better hair at the end of it. I'm not sure, It depends.
Maybe it's a good autistic thing, because teleporting would be good, right? Because then I wouldn't have to go through the travel part. I could just get there. So
exactly.
Yeah.
You would just hope all your particles would come back together again. That's the only thing you'd have to worry about. And then, you're good. Dana, thank you so much. If someone's listening to this, they're interested in finding out more about you or like the Awake Project, what are the best ways for people to get in touch with you or learn about you?
Yeah, so the best place to start is to go to my website. It's theawakeproject.org. If you hit .com, you get something else, it's .org. I have basic information in there, including contact info, and I have links to all my social media sites. I've recently started posting in TikTok because I think I can reach a different group there. So all the links are there. The majority of, if you're interested in seeing what other people have to say about things, and if you're on Facebook, that's really the one that gets the most action, if you will. The website, I also, every time I mine an article, I put it on the website in one of the folders. So there's what I call special interest articles that are not research based, and then there's peer reviewed that are research based. I have a recommendations for readings and a book list on there that you can see. So that's sort of, I refer to that as kind of like my basic landing pad, and then you can get to everything else fanning out from there. Yeah.
Awesome. And I'll put that.
Okay. Great.
Awesome. I'll put that in the description. Thank you, Dana, so much for spending time
here
today.
Thank you for having me. I had a blast.
Me too.
Thanks, Glenn.
Wasn't that awesome? If you are interested in finding out more about Dana or the Awake Project, the information is in the description below. If you got any value from this interview, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Doing so helps to get this information to others just like you. See you in the next episode, and thanks for watching.